Hi, so today's session I thought would be about dealing with anxiety and those thoughts that can really steer how we behave and how we treat people. So we often get thoughts in our head that are anxious or worrying thoughts, and those can actually enable us or disable us from behaving in ways that we should. So there might be negative ones where we are overthinking something, or simply just ones where we doubt ourselves, lack confidence, and it prevents us from leading the life that perhaps we should. So what I do with my clients is I have a really good tool, which is called a thought monitoring tool. And the form itself is very similar to things you might have already seen, like journals where you record your thoughts and reassess them. So that in itself is a really good way of working through what you're thinking and how accurate it is. But in addition to that are the thought processes that we have in the first place. And most of my clients take a lot of comfort from the fact there's a rational explanation for them. And we call these unhelpful thinking styles or thinking errors. And I'll share my screen so you can. So here we have the 10 listed. And what I will do is I'll go through them all so you can see them in greater detail, but also understand them. So the first two is the all or nothing thinking, often referred to as black and white thinking. And the example they give, if I'm not perfect, I have failed, or I either do it right or not at all. So it's one of those things that we often do and don't appreciate how black or white we're being. He either likes me or he doesn't, as opposed to, well, he might like me a little bit, or he might be warming to me, but it's too clear cut. And often when we think in this way, we're limiting ourselves and we're limiting the options. So it's either good or it's bad. And that's not necessarily an accurate way of thinking. I'm going to the right now, overgeneralizing. So when we hear or witness something, that we take it too literally. So everything is always rubbish. There's another example, nothing good ever happens. It always happens to me. I'm always unlucky. No one ever listens to me. So what we do is, rather than taking this single event or this single experience, we club it together with many, many others. And again, that's not accurate. And neither is it helpful, because what we are doing is we are putting into our heads that we are almost deserving of this, and then it's deliberately going to be bad for us, or it's intentionally going to impact on us. So overgeneralizing, very much to do with the language. So our language is one of, oh, chance in a million, I've told you a million times never to exaggerate, you're always late. So our language itself encourages us to overgeneralize. I often say to my clients that any good drama that they're watching will rely on these 10 unhelpful think errors to create the drama. So somebody has to misunderstand somebody's intentions. There has to be a warped view of what's actually happening. So if you often enjoy a soap opera, for example, and use these sheets as a guide and start looking for where the characters are jumping to conclusions or mentally filtering, it's a really good way of spotting it, and then obviously applying it to yourself as well. So the third one, mental filter, where we only pay attention to certain types of evidence. Now, this is a clear one that we do all the time. The negatives are often more memorable. I give the example of headlines in a newspaper. The newspaper will only ever give you bad, doom and gloom, tragedy, cost of living crisis, climate change. It invariably doesn't report the good stuff, because they don't feel that's newsworthy, maybe, or that's not what sells newspapers, that's not what captures people's attention. So again, similar to the soap operas, the drama is what seems to appeal to us. So that's essentially what we are tuned in to listen to and tuned in to look for. But what that inevitably does is have a downside, is that actually all we are looking for is those dramatic negative headlines. And again, that's not an accurate portrayal. So remembering the times you failed is not proportionate to the times that you've actually done quite well and succeeded. And maybe because that's more the norm, so the failures stand out as the one-offs. But again, it's the fact that they stand out means we're filtering out the positives, which isn't, again, helpful. And when we're talking about anxiety, can really drive anxiety. Disqualify the positive. So again, similar to the mental filter, we're discounting the good things that have happened. We're disqualifying those positives. So even when we do succeed, we do have some success, we attribute it to somebody else, or we dismiss it as, oh, I was just lucky to be in the right place, or it doesn't normally happen to me. So we don't actually credit ourselves with the achievements that we have. So further down, jump into conclusions. Again, drama, soap operas totally rely on this. So the two key types are mind reading and fortune telling. So the mind reading, I often hear that with people talking about their spouses, the expectation that he will know that he should have put out the bins, or that she should understand that I want time off to watch the football, or whatever. But there's that anticipation that if we know somebody really well, or we think they know us well, that they should know what we're thinking or what we're expecting or what we want without having to communicate it. And it's amazing how people take offence. And it's our anniversary. Of course he should have known I would love a romantic dinner. Well, of course he should. So again, that mind reading is a very powerful tool, and it's amazing how many people get blamed or accused or have arguments over the things that they actually didn't know they were supposed to do. So mind reading, very powerful. And then the fortune telling. So we sort of, again, jump to those conclusions and we predict how it's going to turn out. I had a client whose husband would often be late home on the train. So sure, she was fortune telling and predicting that he was having an affair. This was going to lead to a divorce. So again, you can be very convincing, but what you're doing is predicting tragedy, upset. And again, it's not necessarily accurate. The late home on the train scenario could have a different explanation, but what you're doing is, because you're anxiety ridden, you're looking for the negatives again. And it works all in conjunction with these other thinking areas. Magnifying, catastrophizing. I've never even heard of the word catastrophizing, but it does seem to become much more widespread and well known. So when we blow things out of proportion, or indeed, it's that shrinking and we make things seem less important. I've just given you a good example of where the fortune telling was leading to a divorce. So what we can do is we sort of make out that it's all going to be an absolute nightmare. Again, our English language perpetuates those exaggerations. It's going to be a nightmare if this happens. This is going to be a complete disaster because something's missing or something's gone wrong. And again, a confident person who hadn't got any anxiety would just be looking at, right, there's a problem, how can we put that right, as opposed to thinking that everything was going to go wrong as a result. Emotional reasoning. Now, again, hugely powerful, that we attribute our feelings as being 100% accurate, and they're just simply not. So I always say to my clients that your feelings are always valid. So if you feel happy or sad, those are valid feelings. But whether they are accurate based on what you think has happened to you is always questionable. So you might feel unhappy because of what somebody has done. You are right to feel unhappy, but that doesn't mean that what you think that person has done was intentional or had any malicious intent to make you feel that way. So emotional reasoning is when we assume that because we feel something, it must be true. So if I have very strong feelings, I'm taking those feelings as 100% accurate. And really what we know now is that those feelings aren't necessarily accurate. A good example they give there is, I feel embarrassed, so I must be an idiot. So because you're feeling humiliated, well, again, more often than not, your feelings of embarrassment are purely what you feel, and other people in the room aren't noticing your embarrassment, haven't even noticed that you've made a mistake that makes you feel embarrassed. So other people's perspective can often be very, very different on exactly the same situation. The shoulds must, using very critical words. If you suffer from anxiety, you will more often than not beat yourself up on a daily basis about things you should have done, must have done, ought to do. And the words, again, are very powerful because they are bullying you into that anxious, anxiety-ridden state, and also make you feel rubbish. So putting pressure on ourselves to do more or be more can often just bring you down. If those goals that you are setting yourself are not achievable, berating yourself time and time again that you should have done them, you could have done them, again, just makes you even feel worse. So not happy, not productive, not good. Labeling. I'm a loser, I'm completely useless, they're an idiot, she's always late, she couldn't organise anything even she tried. We're very good at casting aspersions or negative labels on ourselves and other people. I'm always useless, I can't cook. Those kind of statements, because we repeat them over and over again in a very self-effacing way, but actually start to sink in. If you've heard of mantras, they're almost the opposite. The idea is you do a positive reaffirming statement, because sometimes those labels, I've got no common sense, start to become true, and they aren't true. But again, if we expect ourselves not to be able to do these things, it's true, isn't it? They often say, if you say you can't, you can't. If you say you can, you can. Because again, it's about how you approach things. And finally, personalization. So blaming yourself for something that's happened or for a scenario when it really wasn't your responsibility in the first place. Giving yourself that blame that if you had done something different, it could have changed things. And obviously the same is true of other people. So blaming your partner for not arranging that romantic meal when you feel they should have understood that that's exactly what you wanted because you'd hinted at it 6 months ago. So again, personalization is another thinking area, and all of these areas allow us to feel negative about a scenario, and they are very common and they're automatic because all of these are part of the defense mechanism that we have as an instinctive one. I'm sure you've already come across the fight, flight, freeze response, and it's all part of that. We are naturally on a awareness for danger. We are constantly looking for any kind of threats and risk to ourselves. So as we go through life, that, if you like, is a great measure for protecting ourselves. But equally, we can start interpreting events in that negative way. And all those thinking areas are just doing that, that they're just kind of part of that self-preservation mode. But if you are feeling anxious, if you are a big worrier, those thoughts can get disproportionate. And what you'll find is that on almost every occasion, you're assuming things are going to be negative, or you're already talking yourself out of situations, and your confidence is becoming affected and your self-esteem is being impacted. So it's a real pot to fall in, and you can get on that sort of slippery slope quite easily, really. And if you're naturally disposed to anxiety, I'm sure you'll relate to a lot of those automatic thinking areas as I was going through them. So one of the tools to combat them, and I'll share my screen again. So it's a thought monitoring tool, and you can see it there on my screen. Now, I mentioned earlier about journals, and there are other different variations of this. And essentially, they all have the same emphasis, which is to identify the situation, identify how you're feeling, look at the thoughts and beliefs that you have around that, see where, if any, there are thinking areas present, and then start to challenge those. Because what we often find ourselves doing is back to that. We believe we feel this way and therefore it must be true. And we convince ourselves. And actually, well, as soon as we start to challenge it, we start looking at it from a different angle, and that alternative perspective can really stop and lift you out of your low mood, or enable you to see a situation in a different light. So, pick any situation. Let's say a job interview. So you might have feelings of nervousness, feeling that you have imposter syndrome. You might not feel totally experienced or qualified. You will have feelings which will set you on edge for any job interview. Now, your thoughts and beliefs might be you're useless at job interviews, you don't come across very well, you aren't a clear speaker. And you might have other beliefs in addition to that. And then the idea is you look at those thinking errors. So are you overgeneralizing? Because presumably at some point you have been successful at a job interview. So are you again looking at that mental filtering? So you're only looking for the headlines of where you didn't get a job as opposed to the ones that you did get. Are you disqualifying the positive, all the experience that you do have on your CV versus the little bits that you wish you had that you didn't? And again, it's just going through all those different things that you might be experiencing, and those thinking errors, once you start seeing them, you might indeed see a pattern. So it might be a job interview, or it might be an occasion at work. So the situation was you went to a meeting and you felt you were not heard for some reason. Your feelings might be that you don't believe your manager values you. You might feel you're not being utilised enough at work. It will vary from situation to situation. You're doing your thoughts and beliefs about your work position, how you're regarded. That will all come into play there. And a lot of those things would purely be how you see your situation. Are you doing all or nothing? Are you just thinking, I'm either liked or I'm not liked? Are you overgeneralising? Are you jumping to conclusions? Are you mind reading? Do you know what your manager thinks of you? It might be that actually your last review with your manager was really very positive, and you've disqualified that experience because of late you feel like the relationship has suffered. At what point might it be your manager's problems? Maybe they're having issues with their manager or at home, and just because they're bringing those feelings to work and not treating you in a familiar way, you're taking it personally. So you're personalizing it. You're doing emotional reasoning in a different way. So again, going through whatever the situation is and just seeing if you've got those thinking errors present. And then this is where you go to the next session and you start to challenge it. So is there an alternative, more balanced view? What do other people think of you? What have your colleagues said? In the case of the job interview, how many job interviews have you not got versus the ones that you have got? The ones that you didn't get, were you really passionate about that job in the first place, or did you only get the jobs that you really wanted anyway? So try to look at the balance. Has your manager been positive for the last 5 years while you've been in there and just been off for the last 6 months? Again, try and look at it from a different, more rational perspective. Now, is there any evidence that contradicts my perception? So again, I mentioned how many jobs have you got versus how many job interviews did you not, or were you not successful at? Is there, how many reviews have you had with your manager that have been positive versus the negative ones? Because often what we have is we've dismissed that evidence because we're trying so desperately to focus on why it's got so bad and why it's awful, that all we're seeing is the evidence that supports that view, and we're dismissing anything else. What would I tell a friend who was in this situation? We often give advice to our friends, and it's really sound advice. We don't necessarily treat ourselves as kindly. So if you can imagine, giving advice to a friend in the same situation, what would you be telling them? Well, your manager's always spoken highly of you in the past, or you've always been really good at job interviews. Why is this any different? I suspect that your advice that you would give a friend would be something you'd really like to hear from yourself now. So again, it's about being kind to yourself. And then ultimately the last box is the positive action section. So is there something that you can do? Do I actually need to arrange a one-on-one meeting with my manager to discuss, my concerns? And go in, once you've done this form, you'll think, well, actually, I just need to clear the air. Maybe there is an issue with my work, or maybe there isn't. Maybe they're being pressurized from someone else. So positive action might be just, let's have a communication, let's have some kind of meeting and see if, are there any issues with my work? Ask your manager, is everything all right? Is there anything you want me to improve? And get to the bottom of it, as opposed to the mind reading. The job interviews, well, if when it comes to the evidence, you find out, the amount of job interviews that you don't get versus the ones you do is outweighing the positives. So maybe some positive action would be, I need to prep, I need to do more interview practice. There's great YouTube videos I can do. Maybe I just need to, rather than panic about, not performing really well, maybe I can just practice and really ensure that I'm well prepared for this one. And those forms really can work for any situation. And I've given you a couple, but it can be with your spouse, an argument, a family member, dispute with a sibling. It could be anything, really. I had one client who felt that every time she walked into the staff room, she was being talked about. So anything that you have worried about, any situation that has caused you problems, anxiety, meeting new people, going to a wedding, it doesn't really matter. This process can work for any situation. And the idea that you challenge and try and step out of yourself for a moment and just look with some clarity at your situation, rather than letting your little anxious voice talk you into something. So that's the thought monitoring form. They're the unhelpful thinking styles and errors. And if you use a combination of the two, you really can start to address those negative, conscious and anxious thoughts, which ultimately steer our thought processes, steer our behaviour, and make us feel rubbish. So good luck. Practice is the key. Don't think just doing a couple and you've got it down. The idea is you put them into a routine and you really start to use them. If you're doing an action plan, put them on. Because now I can do these almost in my head. But, it's taken years of practice, and you won't be able to do it straight off the bat because your anxiety is the habit. And that's a really strong pattern of behaviour. So to break any habit, you really need to hit this, doing them frequently and forever. These tools for coaching are not just a one-off. The idea is that you put them into your life, and whenever you've got an instant, you go, right, I'll go back to basics. Let's go and get that thought monitor form and see where I'm at and see if it can steer me slightly differently. So good luck.